Hey everyone, welcome back to the feature-length podcast book club. I am Marco, one of your usual hosts, joined once again by our guest, Dante.
Hey everyone.
Hey everyone, okay. So apologies, first of all. I know we were doing this on kind of a weekly basis to keep up with our actual reading.
Yep.
Unfortunately, we got sidetracked because I contracted pneumonia. And listening to me absolutely hack on this podcast would have been not fun for anyone, so I needed to wait at least for my cough to get into a place where it's more chill, which it is now, although I'm sure a few coughs will still be heard across this podcast.
Exactly.
But if you've been following along, again, as per usual, we are continuing our journey through the modern Prometheus, aka Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's incredible piece of work. Doing this once again because this is Dante's ISU for his grade 12 English class, and it's my favorite book, and it's his first time reading it, so we just thought it would be fun to go through and do this, and we are back to continue.
We're back in
today,
business.
You know, the first few episodes we kind of split things up more into smaller chunks. You know, we did the letters by themselves,
right?
Then we split the first volume into two parts by itself.
Yep.
For this part of the book, volume 2. We're doing Volume 2, all of it at once. So this episode will cover the entirety of Volume 2, chapters 1 to 9 of Volume 2. Again, if you have the 1931 revision that doesn't split it into volumes, just look up what chapters that corresponds to.
Yeah.
But effectively, it's the chapters where we finally catch up with the creature, and the creature recounts the tales of what he's been doing since his creation for the last 2 years. So, and it's pretty self-contained as a volume. There's a lot of smaller chapters in this volume that just sort of tell one longer story.
Yeah, and that's what helped doing it in one shot.
It's almost like a short story.
Yeah, exactly.
In the middle of this book, we have a singular short story.
Exactly.
So we'll be talking about it. So, to get right into it, as we've been starting everything. Now, this is a little skewed because, Dante, you have finished the book at this point, actually.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, but, so I'm going to ask you to not take anything from Volume 3.
Of course, I won't.
Into this.
Yeah.
But just generally, if you can remember, when you finish Volume 2, you close the page on Chapter 9, Volume 2.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts up to that point of Frankenstein and how you've been enjoying the book and your updated overall opinions?
I remember I told you at the end of Volume 1 I was hooked, and I was absolutely hooked at the end of Volume 2. Yeah, it was crazy. There was so little about the monster throughout the first entire volume of the book, and I was like, okay, we have to pick it up with this chapter, and it did not disappoint. It was insane. And yeah, there's a lot of great imagery and description in this chapter that just set the tone for the rest of the book, and I'm excited to get into it. So
okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also really enjoy this part of the book. I think just incredibly well written, and it does a very, very good job of not taking away from the creature's bad deeds, right? So at the end of Volume 1, Justine, the Frankenstein family's servant, is basically wrongly accused of killing Victor's brother.
Yes.
And Victor is very frustrated by this because he believes it's the creature that he created, although he has no context.
Exactly.
It's his own belief. This creature that he created 2 years prior.
Exactly.
And, he wants to blame it on that. And this chapter, it would be really, really easy for this chapter to come in and be like, oh no, it wasn't the creature, and make the creature totally a sympathetic character.
Yeah.
But in fact, I think this chapter really rides the line of making the creature sympathetic,
for sure,
while also still allowing the creature to be the bad guy, because
exactly.
He did. And actually, not only did he kill the brother, but then to get we're still going to go through this chapter by chapter, but just to jump ahead, when we get to chapter 9, and the creature sort of demands of Victor, his ultimate threat is if you don't fulfill these demands, I'll just kill everyone.
Exactly.
Which is crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the ultimate sympathetic villain.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very crazy. And that was the thing reading this chapter that really got me. I was like, when I'm reading, I always try to pinpoint this is the character I'm gonna side with, but you really can't throughout the entirety of this book. And not to say anything about Volume 3, it's just you really can't side. And that's one of the talking points in my essay, the villain, looking at Victor and the monster, because it's just there's a case to be made for both, for sure.
Yeah, they're singular, which is also why I think there's been a lot of literature and postmodern analysis of the book, which is to say does the monster really exist? Is the monster a manifestation of Victor's dark side? And
right,
because they are both somewhat pathetic?
Yeah, we got there.
Jesus, what is happening to me? I guess I haven't spoken in like spoken. Oh my god.
Oh,
okay,
Lord.
so let's get started here. I'm gonna try and battle through this lingering pneumonia. Let's get to chapter 1. My summary of chapter 1 reads: Victor falls into a deep depression over Justine's death, and they flee the country.
Yes.
Or they flee to the countryside instead of being in the city.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's really chapter 1 of this is basically he's like, this sucks.
Yeah.
And then him, Elizabeth, and his dad are like, man, we got to get out of here. And so they flee to kind of like a cabin, and it's more about the journey they go on to get there.
It's essentially just a moral rebound for the end of volume 1. So.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Did you have any specific notes on this chapter?
Not really. I just wrote that Elizabeth was mourning, his father was mourning and was quite insensitive. He was having a hard time, and that's really it for this chapter, to be honest.
Yeah, I think, the only real note that I had, they make note of sort of the journey being tough.
Yeah.
And painful.
Sure.
And something's going to happen in the next chapter where Victor like ditches his family and then goes on like a separate excursion.
Yep.
So just to point out, in the 1831 rewrite or edited version, Victor goes on this entire excursion, even the part in chapter 1, by himself. The family doesn't go with him at all.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
And I think, in a way, like him going on this journey and it being such a tough journey, like. We already talked about pathetic fallacy, like the environment representing like emotional states or themes.
Yep.
Him
Which
going
will continue to show up as well in this. For sure. Yeah.
Him going on that journey. I keep letting him going on that journey and then having that tough like physical journey to go on. Ultimately, and to jump ahead a little bit, meeting up with the creature, hearing about the creature and the creature's demands of him is almost like. It's his penance or his opportunity to make up for, I think, ultimately the thing that, like, in a way, Justine's death is Victor's,
like,
it's his biggest crime.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and so, like, this whole part of the book, we talked about Act 2 being where you throw the stones, right? It sets up for Victor that his only real path for redemption is going to be, like, dealing with the consequences of creating this creature, because Justine's death is ultimately transitively his fault.
Yes.
Because he created the creature, mistreated the creature then ultimately through the actions we're going to see in these following chapters kills Justine because of the things that happen to him. So yeah, it's almost like that journey that he goes on at the start of chapter 1 and then ultimately also the narrative journey of the creature sets up potentially a path for Victor's redemption.
Right.
To sort of make up for that. And then, as we talked about with the 3-act structure, get out of the quote-unquote tree safely at the end.
Exactly.
If he's able to redeem and sort of make up for that senseless death of Justine.
Yep. For sure.
Which also, I guess, to tie into, we don't have to keep it a secret because it's in this.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, chapter 9 ends with the creature saying, you need to make another creature, which is like someone for me to be with.
Yes.
Because you've left me alone, and this is like a terrible existence, and you're my creator, and you have like a responsibility towards me. Which, on the one hand, is like
fair,
thematic because it's like his responsibility to the creature, but then on the other hand, if you also again think about his path to redemption being like Justine died a senseless death, and so like the only way for him to sort of redeem himself is to then like bring another life into the world, right? So it like it ties together that it ties together that way as well, that if he's able to go through with that, maybe there's a path to redemption. But so all of that is just set up by sort of like the pathetic fallacy in chapter 1 of this physical journey that he's going on before he has to have an emotional journey.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
I could bring us into chapter 2
then, go
if
for
you'd
it.
like. So for chapter 2, it said that Victor received the greatest consolation from nature. So again, going back to pathetic fallacy, he actually received comfort by it, and this is one of the points in the story where he wasn't actually going on some giant trek and he just took it in.
Yeah.
Victor's family was relying on him to stay strong because they were just depressed the whole time. Victor went alone to the summit of Montanvert to compose himself after a slight relapse in his unhappiness, but it was nothing like we saw in Volume 1 and Clerval having to take care of him. And then we see the monster approaching his creator for the first time in this chapter. The quote was, "The wretch hastily approached him on Montanvert," which is the mountain. So we saw that. And this is where the monster proposes the ultimatum to Victor. So Victor could hear out his story and his journey, and after that decides to do what he pleases. Or if Victor rejected this offer, the monster said, "I'll not only inflict torture upon you, but the rest of humanity." So the monster's tweaking out.
Yeah, the monster's completely tweaking, yeah.
And of course, Victor agreed to hear the monster's tale.
Correct, because I think Victor, immediately after seeing the monster, is like, "Damn, you killed my brother, huh?" And the monster's like, listen. We gotta talk. We have to talk first. And then Victor's like, "I don't want to talk to you. I want to freaking kill you."
Yeah.
And then the monster's like, he's like, "Listen, you can either come back with me to my hut, I'll make us a cozy fire, I'll tell you the story.
Yeah.
Or I will be a plague upon all of humanity for the rest of all time." And Victor's like, "All right, well, I don't know. I guess I'm going to listen to you."
Victor was pissed. He even described how Victor like lunged at him and the monster like had to evade him. Like, Victor was ready to throw hands
the monster
at him.
Absolutely dodged over his way. I have a few quotes from this chapter.
Sure.
So let me just pull them up. So the few quotes I have here are really from that kind of initial meeting. And it's the monster sort of trying to sway Victor. And it's the first time, I think it's important to say, like, this is the first time we've heard the monster speak.
Yes. That's right.
The monster was born. He stood at the edge of the bed and was like, "Huh?" And then he, like, left. And we haven't heard from the monster since.
Yep.
And we think maybe he killed the brother.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to pull these few quotes here. First of all, Victor's like, "You're the devil, blah, blah, blah." He's all angry.
Yeah.
And then the monster says, "I expected this reception. All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated who am miserable beyond all living things?" Which I just thought was, like, a good quote. Obviously, wretched. We joke about how often that word is in here. But, yeah, I don't know. I just think it's interesting. All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated who am miserable beyond all living things? Like,
right, exactly.
Even among the, like, the wretched, he feels like he's like a step above. Like, he is completely unlovable, unknowable. Like, he is a just wretched disaster. That's the first one.
And we're going to completely find out why.
Yeah. And then, again, Victor is like, he's raging. This is the part, I sprang on him, impelled by all the feelings which can one arm bring against the and then Victor says he easily eluded me. So I'm just imagining Victor like lunging and the monster just like sidesteps him. Yeah, like and then surprised. And then the monster says, "Be calm. I entreat you to hear me before you give vent to your hatred on my devoted head. Have I not suffered enough that you seek to increase my misery? Life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me and I will defend it." Which is, I think, again, really sets the stage for, like, his entire life. Like, he thinks of his life as life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish. Like, these 2 years, his life has been nothing but just, like, a disaster.
Yeah.
But then even still, even with that, is dear to me and I will defend it. And he's like, no, like, I'm alive. I want to be alive.
Right.
It sucks what my circumstances have been.
Yeah.
But I implore you to hear me out because you have no idea what this has been like for me because you just absolutely deserted me. And then the final quote kind of in this section here that I really like. "Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed." Which, interesting because it's like a religious allusion.
Yeah,
obviously, to the story of Adam. Which makes sense because, like, obviously, I mean, on the very surface level, because Victor gave him life.
Yes,
of course. But he's basically saying, like, I should be your Adam. I should be your... You know, people religiously talk about Adam as being, like, created in the image of God.
Right.
Like, I should be your loved, perfect being that was given this Garden of Eden, and instead, like, I'm your fallen angel, referring to the devil. He's like, you know, I should have been one thing, and now I'm the other. And once again, like, you should owe me something for that. Like, you've been a bad creator. You know, you need to think of yourself as a creator. And ultimately, I think, like, those are some of the things that the creature's saying that throughout this. There's more lines like that. I thought those were big standout ones that ultimately lead Victor to be like, all right, like, I'll hear you out.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're elaborated on more as the book goes on.
Yeah, for sure. There's another quote in here that I really like. Where the creature says, "You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of man." Which I think is, like, interesting that this book from, like, 1813, right?
18.
18? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Like, that quote is literally, like, already pointing sort of like a moral look at sort of like the death sentence and stuff like that. Where he's like, you accuse me of murder, and then you think in good conscience that like I should be murdered,
right?
And that's gonna fix everything. Like,
exactly.
And then sarcastically, the creature to be like, oh, praise the eternal justice of man. Also, I think hearkening then back and pulling on Victor's heartstrings a little bit to be like, think about the injustice that happened to Justine.
Yeah, that's very true.
And again, part of sort of the swaying of Victor to be like, let me hear this creature out, because what happened to Justine, like, on the surface level, everybody was like, no, this makes perfect sense, but Victor, knowing all the details, was like, wait, this is so, like, unjust.
Right.
And so now the monster's sort of playing on that and making Victor reconsider that, hey, maybe I don't know, like, all the details, and so maybe I'm now being the people that condemned Justine to death for no reason, which is cool. There's also a footnote here that I loved. So there's a quick quote here. Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent, my soul glowed with love and humanity, but I am not alone, miserably alone. And the footnote says of that, this is the first indication that the creature, made from parts of other creatures, has a soul. Whence did it arise? Later, Victor claims that he gave the creature a soul by a process undescribed. So, this is interesting to me because I think it like, and I have more notes about this as we get later into these chapters in this volume, and we talk about the monster story and sort of like how he develops.
Okay.
But there is sort of like this thing in the book where we're not quite sure, and there are sort of hints that, like, is this creature actually a new being?
Right.
Or is the creature a reanimated being?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Because, yes, it's parts from different bodies.
That's true.
But is there an argument to be made that, like, whatever the brain they took and reanimated, like, whatever person that brain belonged to, is that now basically this creature? And it's not that necessarily this creature has, like, a new conscience, but more that he has, like, a repressed one that he's slowly rediscovering throughout the chapters we read. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that might be the case and some hints to that.
All right.
But, like, I'm curious what your thoughts on that are a little bit. Like, do we think this creature is a new soul? Or do we think it's either, like an existing person or an amalgamation of existing people?
Right. I think... the way I viewed him reading this volume... I thought of him as a completely new creature.
Yeah.
One soul. I know his formation was a bunch of parts from a bunch of different people and different organs.
Yeah.
And different bones, but I think ultimately viewing the monster as a person and as somebody who's having lived experience, I think he's one soul, and I think he's figuring things out for the first time. But yeah, looking at how he learned language and how he learned certain things and how he picked up on these things really quickly, I kind of feel like I know what you're saying in the sense of, like, okay, maybe he's recovering some of these suppressed things from his previous life. I can see that. I'm excited to see how you're going to elaborate that and state that case. But the way I thought of it, reading of it, I completely thought, I know he's a bunch of different parts, but for sure, one soul, one person.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
It is interesting.
And again, like the footnote alludes to that later, Victor like will make reference to the fact that he bestowed like a soul upon the creature.
Exactly.
But it's also like how.
Yeah, I mean,
which doesn't really. I mean, again, it doesn't really matter. But it's kind of interesting. Like what, you know, or do people even have souls? Which is like a whole separate conversation. Like
we have to get Dad in for this one.
Yeah. Like, are you just made up by your brainwaves, or in which case that this is then just sort of more of like a reanimated, and there's some clues to that as we go through. Okay, do you have any more notes on chapter 2?
No, that's pretty much it, to be honest. After chapter 3 for me is where it got really juicy.
Okay, so I'll read my summary of chapter 3.
Sure.
So the creature starts his story. He starts telling Victor his story of what's been going on the last 2 years. Also, funny because it's like a story in a story. Because Victor, everything we're reading is Victor's story.
From Walton.
Yeah. Correct. So the creature then starts his story, which is hilarious. So basically the creature fled after being born.
Yes.
He tried to stay alive in the forest, and ultimately went from cottage to cottage, kind of like being run out by villagers in those places because they thought he was so hideous.
Yep.
So we see a little bit of it just sort of like him trying to stay alive and find warmth and all that type of stuff. Eventually he finds sort of like an abandoned one that he can stay in. And there are sort of like neighbors to this one.
Yes.
Who it's basically a young man, a woman, and an old man.
Yes.
It's like this little family that's staying in this abandoned cottage that he discovers, and he starts to kind of become a little bit obsessed with and view a little bit. So, do you have any thoughts on chapter 3?
Oh yeah. I have some things to talk about. So, I just like to give a shout out to Mary Shelley just because of some of the descriptions that for the monster realizing things for the first time. I just thought it was really awesome. So the monster describes his entry to the world. This is on page 80. And
of your book.
Of my book, yeah.
Yeah, so that means nothing.
Yeah, this is of the
1818
version, yeah. The monster says, "Before, dark and opaque bodies had surrounded me, impervious to my touch or sight, but I now found that I could wander on at liberty, with no obstacles which I could not either surmount or avoid." That's just like, I would not even know how to go about describing an entry to life, but that's just, that's really cool. Interesting to know, one of the first things he did when he got outside the monster was weep when he was made. Which is something I found to be interesting. One of the first things after being brought into this world was experience sadness. Yeah. Above all the other emotions, above joy.
Well, when babies come out, they're crying.
I mean, okay, you know what? That is a fair point.
Yeah. I think that's an allusion to that.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah. But also, I get what you're saying because he's fully formed, which we'll talk a little bit about. But because he's a fully formed person, and it really sets the stage for, like, that his life is misery, as he talked about in the previous chapter. So,
for sure. And I'd also like to mention his discovery of fire early on, because I thought that was kind of notable. I put down here the evolution of man, page 81, because I just thought that was like significant, and the way he discovers things throughout his journey, I feel like it kind of is symbolic to the evolution of man. I think the fire is the first stage of that. And and the notion of fire as well, which we're going to see, I feel like has a correlation to rage, and we're going to continue to see that throughout the course of this volume. So I just thought that use of fire for a number of reasons was really interesting and was very well placed. And to continue on this process of evolution, he started to become a hunter-gatherer, and he mostly gathered berries, which was the next step. Also just after the birth of fire, and as civilizations became more advanced, obviously the hunter-gathering stage very important. So I just thought that was really cool how Mary Shelley was continuing with that kind of plot. And then, as you said, he was looking for a place to stay. People scared him out, and he found shelter next to this family, and I believe it was a small town in Germany. I'm like 90% sure that's where it was. I don't remember the exact name of the village, but
maybe it was France.
Maybe it was,
maybe they were from France and then they got. Well, that's because they get banished.
Yeah,
right? That's why they're in this random cottage. In the middle of nowhere.
But we're gonna get to that.
Which we'll get to.
Yeah. But I just thought that was really interesting. So some of the key things that stuck out to me was the description of him becoming animated and coming to life. The concept of fire, which we're gonna see how that's used throughout the course of this volume and the rest of the book. And this like idea of evolution, which we're gonna see just continue. But those were some of the key points I thought to be pretty notable.
Cool. Yeah, okay, I have a couple quotes here.
Yeah,
so in terms of what you were saying, with sort of like the way that he's brought into the world in sadness, I have a quote here. "I was a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing, but feeling pain invade me on all sides, I sat down and wept," which is the line that you're talking about.
Yes.
So, but, and again, very sort of like drawing an allusion to sort of like being born, but then also like understanding that he's just like this wretched creature and setting up sort of that theme.
Yes, for sure.
And then I have one more quote in this chapter. I think in the next chapter, there's a bit more of like an interesting conversation I want to have, but...
Sure, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So this is just kind of like a quote that I like, but basically he goes to this hut where he finds some food, and he like steals the food. This is part of his journey to get to his like final home, I would say, but like along the way. And the quote is, when he's eating the food, he says, "I greedily devoured the remnants of the shepherd's breakfast, which consisted of bread, cheese, milk, and wine. The latter, however, I did not like." Which I thought, just again, speaking to sort of like what you're saying, the evolution of man, and even though he's like this fully formed man creature, thinking of him as still sort of like childlike and innocent.
Exactly.
And the idea that like universal experience of everybody tries wine for the first time, they're like, this is disgusting. And then everybody's like, oh, when you get older, you'll appreciate it. Like,
exactly.
That's like... Yeah, I just thought it's just a really, like, Mary Shelley, I think, is so good at finding those little moments where you can, like, tie into the humanity of it.
Yes, for sure.
And make you go, oh, I get that. Like, it instantly puts you in a mindset of, like, where this creature is at. Like,
Exactly.
It's totally unnecessary. Like that semicolon, with the latter, however, I did not like, is like such an easy cut.
Right.
It could just be, I ate all this food.
Exactly, yeah.
It's such like a simple but really, really effective thing that she includes there.
I feel like it ties into our relatability to the monsters, the readers.
Of course,
gives them
yeah. Which is so important to do in this chapter because, as we talked about, like, she is not trying to take away from the bad things that he
for sure
has done and will do, but it's
sure.
more just like to give context to that in a way that makes you go, oh, this is complicated.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, chapter 4?
Chapter 4.
Okay, so my summary is the creature realizes his neighbors, Felix, Agatha, and the father, are poor. At night, he performs tasks to help them, and he ends up sort of learning their language through listening to them and the conversations that they have. So, yeah, over this period of time, he kind of learns them. He notices how hard they're constantly working, so when they all go to sleep, he's kind of like the helpful little elf that will, like, do tasks for them to give them more time to like enjoy each other throughout the day.
For sure. Yeah, so for this, I'd like to point out kind of his growth, like, as a human being, starting, I know we talked about, he wept when he was first created, and we talked about, that food thing, which was really funny. I had never really thought about that like, he didn't like certain foods, and this kind of ties into the next stage of that kind of childlike development.
Yeah.
It was made a point that he asked many questions about the nature and relationships with another, and that to me is just like the biggest thing for a child is why this, why that, what this. So just hearing the monster having these dilemmas like definitely triggered that for me, and I was like, oh, that's really cool the way she's like developing this fully grown creature, but as like this child now he's learning for the first time.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the next step in that, for my view. And then on page 88, on my text it said, and the monster made a point of really driving this home. He said the trait of kindness moved me sensibly. So which really shows just the genuine good-naturedness of the monster, and he really wasn't this wretch that he was continually viewed as and seen by all these other people. He really was just trying to do good, wanted to understand good. So I thought that was really important, and that notion of kindness moved me sensibly is we're going to see the growth of that, and unfortunately some of the stripping away of that in this volume.
Yeah.
He also referred to human communication as a godlike science.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, even if you're looking at this from the perspective of a kid, you pick up a book you never read for the first time, you're like, whoa, like, it's just, it feels so, like, above you, and I feel like him kind of hearing these people speak in this way, maybe kind of triggered that same, like, childlike tendency, but also a godlike science. We know that anytime Mary Shelley mentions religion is something that's vitally important, especially in this book. So yeah, for sure. And he doesn't take that with a grain of salt. He makes an initiative to learn language and to do all these things. As you said, the girl's Agatha, boy is Felix, and the father, whose name we learned to find out is not stated yet.
Yeah.
But yeah. And so for the actual timeline, he stayed and observed this family through the winter. It was turning into winter time when he met with them for the first time, and he observed them into the following spring. And as you said, he developed this routine in secrecy to aid them, and he would do these little acts of kindness, and he would hear them use the words wonderful and good-spirited to refer to his aid. They, I think, referred to him as like a spirit of goodwill or something, that just these good things keep happening. And I want to tie this back to a previous discussion we had.
Okay.
I know you mentioned this notion of dead destiny in this novel, and how it's more in the version you have. You said there's a lot of changes that kind of correlate to destiny more, but I did find one in here that I do want to mention. So here it is on page 91. He says, when I slept or was absent, the forms of the venerable blind father, the gentle Agatha, and the excellent Felix flitted before me. I looked upon them as superior beings who would be the arbiters of my future destiny. And obviously they would be, and maybe not in the sense that we think they will be right now, but that's just very interesting, like arbiters of my future destiny. There's the notion of destiny with Victor, which we've touched on the most, but also the sense of destiny with the monster now, where I feel like this is kind of the first time it's really like introduced, and it's just interesting how that goes both ways for the monster and Victor. It just seems like it was destined to happen, which we've talked about. But yeah, I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the point that so much of this section of the book is trying to drive home is that like Victor is the one with, at least again in the original version.
Yep.
That Victor is the one with free will.
Right.
And he almost has like a responsibility for the monster's destiny.
Exactly.
Which you can look at as like a commentary of like a creator having the responsibility for like our destinies. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So I think it's an interesting parallel to draw there. Yeah, for the monster to be kind of like referring to his own destiny and feeling like it's Victor's responsibility to take some part in that.
Exactly.
Is a very interesting kind of like religious allegory.
Exactly.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah. And at this point, he doesn't know of Victor as his creator yet, so he's just seeing these people and like being like, "Oh, these are going to be like my people." You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we'll come to find out.
Yeah.
He will find out what happens. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and there's just a small other little point I want to add to this. He sought to reveal himself to the people, of course, which we'll see how that pans out in the rest of this volume. But also, there was a footnote I'd like to mention. So this footnote, it is quite literally called the lapdog and the ass. So the quote from the book is, "It was as the ass and the lapdog, yet surely the gentle ass, whose intentions were affectionate, although his manners were rude, deserved better treatment than blows and execration." Mm-hmm. And so when we go to the back of the book, it says, "The ass and the lapdog." It is a fable of the ass and the lapdog, and it's saying, "Seeing that the lapdog is fondled when he rubs against his master, the ass tries this, but he is shouted at and beaten." So just this kind of notion of like, oh, other beings receive this love and affection for doing these things, yet I'm scolded, I'm
they're
beaten.
cute.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm wretched. So just that notion, I thought that was really interesting. And one last point is actually a quote right after this. The monster says, "Men who before this change seem to have been hid in caves dispersed themselves and were employed in various arts of cultivation." So that just reminded me of the allegory of the cave from Plato, and just seeing how the monster is kind of not really physically in a cave, but he's kind of in this hovel right now, and he's kind of learning all these things, and he's building up the courage to kind of get out of this cave. Yeah. And, we're going to...
Well, it's also like his entire worldview, again, with that allegory, is being defined by his relationship to these people.
Right.
And ultimately, like, the value that he's going to, with what happens later, make judgments about himself based on, like, his relationship to these people.
Yes, so, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought that was... All these little interesting things, like you said, that she inserts. It all has purpose, and it's great. But yeah, that's what I had for chapter 4. That was a pretty big chapter from my understanding.
Yeah, so we can talk now more about the idea of, like, and it'll go into the next chapter as well, but, is the creature relearning things?
Right.
Or is he new or fresh? So one of the things that and this will tie into a footnote, but before that, even just a note that I had is, I do think it's interesting that the creature comes out and the creature's fresh, right?
Yeah.
But already has all these skills that typically, like, you would have relative to your intelligence in other ways. So, like, the creature comes out and, like, is instantly walking.
Right.
The creature understands how to, like, survive on his own. The creature understands how to eat solid food. The creature understands how to do all these things. And then also, the creature is doing all this without any perception of, like, language at that point.
Right.
Which I also find interesting because typically for, like, the average, like, development of a person, you're kind of, like, learning language as your intelligence goes up at the same time, whereas with Victor, it seems like there's this entire period of time where he has... Not with Victor, sorry, with the monster. There's this entire period of time where he has all these different, like, skills, and he's perceiving all these different things, but he has absolutely no language to be able to, like...
I see, okay.
Deal with that.
Yeah.
And it's only, like, now he's recounting this story after he's learned language, and he's like, I know what all those things are.
He has a means of expression.
Yeah, and it's not even necessary. That's not me saying... It's just interesting to me, and I don't know a lot about, in terms of, like, development. I guess this is more, like, psychological or anthropological. It would be interesting to learn more about how that works. Like, if there are studies on people who don't develop language properly.
Right.
Like, how they perceive the world, or, like, how that translates into, like, other types of intelligence, or the fact that the creature has the ability to like do all these things. So anyway,
For sure,
I think that's
yeah.
really, really interesting. I also think in terms of the context of this book specifically, though, it's cool, and it maybe is a hint at no, he's relearning things, because there are a lot of sort of motor skills that he has right away.
Yeah.
Which also motor skills tend to be tied into this idea of like muscle memory, quote unquote.
Yes.
Where you're not consciously like thinking about doing things, because once you know how to do it, your body just does it.
Right.
So the fact that the fact that the monster is born,
Yes.
and then it's just like running around and eating and is able to like manipulate things to create fire and learns how to do all those things so quickly and is like making these correlations to things so quickly. Like a baby can't even like correlate those things. Like babies don't even have object permanence, you know what I mean? Where it's like you show something and then if you take it away, like they have no concept of what that thing is anymore.
Yes.
Whereas like the creature is right away, like his first night alive is like, I need to survive.
Yes.
And has that like naturalistic instinct to do all those things.
Right.
In a way that is sort of like, oh, maybe he does have muscle memory of some stuff.
Ah.
And then
I see your point.
with him learning language, like he talks about like listening to these people and learning the words, but like he's not speaking. Right. Because he doesn't speak because he's on his own, and like learning a language without speaking it is like basically impossible. So the fact that he's like learning language completely solitarily without books just by watching people speak is sort of like, again, is maybe a clue that, oh, maybe he's not learning language, maybe it's just like as these words are happening it's like refiring certain parts of his brain where all of a sudden he's like, oh yeah, like I remember like that part of language or this part of language or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's like the way the creature learns and develops.
Right.
If it was fresh, if it was truly like a fresh soul, doesn't necessarily make sense.
Right. I understand.
It's almost like the stuff is coming back to him, not that it's new.
Right.
In some way.
Yes, for sure.
Which is interesting. And then so that relates into this footnote I have. It's the last thing I have for this chapter, but there's a point in the chapter where the creature describes himself as being deformed.
Yes.
And so the footnote says, what has led the creature to conceive of himself as deformed? Victor certainly fled from his presence, but according to Victor, he made no remarks about the creature's appearance. Similarly, the hut dweller who fled when the creature popped into his hut appears to have been more surprised than repelled, and likely left hurriedly because he was trespassing in someone else's structure. Why also would the creature think that, quote, delicate complexions, end quote, were admirable, except if he had been taught this? Tantalizingly, this passage suggests that the creature's brain was not as blank as is implied, but rather retained memories and attitudes from its previous user. For further evidence of this, see note 5 from chapter 5, which is the next chapter, and I'll read that note. I have that note written down when we get there. But, yeah, it's kind of interesting because it's almost like, it's the same way that, and I'm sure, you know, people use this argument all the time when it comes to, for example, racism or sexism, where it's like a baby that's not taught societally, from a societal perspective, to like think of woman as different or to think of different colored skin as different.
Right.
Like nobody's born racist.
No, yeah.
Nobody's born sexist, right? So this creature, if it's truly a blank slate, and if from his perspective is just reacting to the things around him, how does he like recognize himself as being ugly when he looks in a pool of water? Because all that's happened is that he'll like show up and people are like, oh my god, like, so the correlation there isn't I'm ugly, or even that ugly is a thing, or that beautiful is a thing. Like that, like being beautiful or being ugly is also, in a way, like the commentary here, like a societal judgment. And how would the creature have any concept of that societal judgment because it hasn't been taught to him?
Right.
Like the only thing he could correlate is that the few times he showed up, people have fled.
Right.
But there is no knowledge transfer at any point that like it's because you're a disgusting deformed thing.
Right.
So if he sees himself and thinks that way of himself, that's a pretty strong clue that there is some sort of societal, again, thing stuck in his brain. It's not like a fresh slate, a truly fresh slate would not perceive of like ugly or beautiful in that way.
Right. Right.
So
yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. What?
I don't even know if we're gonna be able to use this, but I'll say it anyway.
Okay.
So in philosophy class actually right now, I have to read two two articles by C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
For my ISU, and one of them is called The Law of Nature.
Okay.
And it's basically C.S. Lewis talking about how we are more alike than we think,
mm-hmm.
and how there are laws that do bind us, like the law of gravity, the law of the thermodynamics, the universal laws of motion, like all these things that are so real,
okay.
and that we are bound to. But then the thing within us, that good and bad, that view of differences, that view of this and that, is, he's arguing objective and not subjective.
Societal?
Right, yeah, not societal, not influenced by society. So to your point, to play devil's advocate to that point, I would say, there is kind of that objective inclination to view himself in certain ways based on humanity, and that is something that, having been in philosophy class, reading this book, trying to make these connections, like, is this thing subjective, is this something truly objective, that just made me think of that. And I was like, when he looks in the water and he sees himself, I feel like he may have this constant, this already established notion of, I am ugly, just because that is the objectivity of it. Because he sees himself as ugly, everybody else sees him as ugly. I feel like there is kind of this objective thing where he's not, like, making this up for himself. You know what I mean?
But I guess the counter-argument to that, a very simple counter-argument to that, in terms of, like, beauty being a objective truth of the world, is that you just look at, like, any beauty standards over 100 years. Like, the beauty standard of men and women from 100 years ago is different from 90 years ago, is different from 80 years ago. Like, the reason fashion changes constantly is because what is considered objectively attractive changes constantly. Like, I understand there are some objective truths in terms of, like, symmetry is always more appealing to look at than non-symmetry, but then even to go a step beyond that and say, like, why would the monster assign value to that? So, okay, maybe the monster objectively can see I'm asymmetrical, whereas other people are symmetrical.
Right.
And so, therefore, you can make an argument that anybody would perceive asymmetry as less attractive than symmetry. Right. Why would the monster be able to make a value judgment that society perceives attractiveness as better than unattractiveness? Is, I guess, where I'm getting at. That's the learned behavior. Okay. It's not that you can't see the differences and go, I look different from that person. Or maybe that you don't have some... But it's like, what society deems... what they add value to is societally driven. And, like, the monster has not been taught in any way that we have seen specifically that to be unattractive is to be less than, or to be a wretch.
Right.
So, like, what would cause him to perceive himself as, like, a wretch?
I see that. It would have to be a societal influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I see your point. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fair.
It'd be different if everybody that fled was like, you were the ugliest, the most disgusting. Yeah. But they don't. They just, like, scream and pass out or whatever. So, like, there's no, like... I don't know. I think it's an interesting point to be like, why would he be carrying that with him if it's not, like, the lingering remnants of somebody who's been taught that?
Right. That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just interesting. I mean, I don't think there's a strong conclusion one way or another in the story.
Right.
But it's interesting.
It's a good talking point, yeah. It's
interesting that he would immediately perceive of himself that way
when
he hasn't been taught that he has less value for it.
Right.
Although I guess by the end... It's funny because by the end of this volume, he is taught that.
Yes.
With what we'll get into. But this is all happening before.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's weird. Like, where does that come from at this point? When he doesn't even understand language.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, this guy doesn't even understand language, but he somehow understands that he is societally less than.
Mm-hmm.
How does he even know what a society is? You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't know. He was, like, living in the forest, ran into a couple people because he needed food. Those people fled. And now he's, like, he's never been in, like, a true society. He has no concept of even what that is. So where is this coming from? Where are these value judgments coming from? Or you could make the argument, I guess, that, well, he is narrating this story to Victor after. Right?
Right.
So maybe it's, like, after learning the language, after learning that lesson that he's going to learn with... We haven't made reference to this, but the father.
Yes.
of this family that he's like vibing with is blind.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole thing that happens with the blind father at the end of this volume, and like maybe it's that experience that teaches him the lesson, and so when he's explaining all this to Victor, he's like applying what he's learned to those past experiences.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get it.
Because we're not actually seeing it in real time, so it's maybe like him telling that story and being like, and now I can deduce that the reason that all these things happened is because I was ugly and because that society deems that. So I guess that's actually, now that I've stumbled upon a good counter argument for this, which is, no, maybe he is a fresh blank slate, and at the time he wasn't understanding it, but because we're hearing his recounting of it, he's applying his learned knowledge to
time
that.
to reflect on it.
Which I guess is an interesting reading as well, but it just depends, like any good piece of literature, like there's different ways to approach it and how you want to read it.
That's what makes it so great.
Yeah, that's what makes it good to talk about. All right, hit me with your chapter 5 summary.
Cool. So chapter 5, his relationship and bond with the cottagers continued to grow. We get the introduction of a woman who brightened Felix's mood and who came to stay with them.
Yep.
And he would watch her intently, and he referred to her as the Arabian. We'd come to find out her name is Saifi.
Yep.
She spoke a different language than them. Although it's not clear that he tried to learn this language. Much of the wretch's language learning occurred at the same time as the Arabian. So Felix and Agatha and the father would speak, and she'd start to understand this language, and the monster would kind of do this at the same time. Almost kind of like monkey see, monkey do. 96 to 97, I made a note of this, is quite sad, and there's great sympathy built for the monster. And I'd like to say a quote on page 97. So on this page of 97 is the monster's first sense of love, and it's in talking about the cottagers. So he says, I will soon explain to what these feelings tended, but allow me to now return to the cottagers, whose story excited in me such various feelings of indignation, delight, and wonder, but which all terminated in additional love and reverence for my protectors. For so I loved, in an innocent, half-painful self-deceit, to call them. Which is kind of that last little bit, half-painful, half-deceit, to call them. We're going to come to find out what happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just kind of... It's a scene of really building the monster as a person and not a monster.
Yeah.
And that really stuck with me reading this, and that really made me resonate with the monster, and I was like, yeah, this is the point in Volume 2 for me that really, like, rounded him out as a character.
Yep.
And now we're just going to see what they're going to do with that character. But I just wanted to see, what other thoughts do you have about Chapter 5?
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, I think it is cool to include this, like, non-native speaker that shows up, and, like, that's how the monster ultimately, like, he's picked up bits and pieces of the language by listening to just the family talk, but then having them actually have to, like, teach somebody else how to speak that language, it makes sense, although... Still doesn't you still can't really learn a language without speaking it.
No, so, it's very difficult.
Yeah, not learn it well anyway. Not well enough to where now he is like fully fluent in speaking. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like I understand that he can maybe understand their conversations, but okay. So there's a few quotes I want to read. One right here is when they're basically recounting like history, I guess, sort of to Saifi.
Yep.
And he says, I heard of the discovery of the American hemisphere and wept with Saifi over the hapless fate of its original inhabitants, which is just funny to me because I'm like, damn, Frankenstein's based. You know what I mean? Like, even in like 1818, Mary Shelley was like, nah. Like Frankenstein, he's like, that's not cool. Like what happened over with the Native Americans. That's a problem.
Yeah.
But anyway, so as I want to read this other. It's kind of a longer section, but I want to read it.
Sure,
but it's basically him, again, learning like language and learning about history and society and context and stuff. And
sure.
He says, a man might be respected with only one of these acquisitions, but without either he was considered, except in very rare instances, a vagabond. Okay, wait, actually, let me start. Let me start from here. The words introduced me to turn towards myself. I learned that the possessions most esteemed by your fellow creatures were high and unsullied descent united with riches. A man might be respected with only one of these acquisitions, but without either he was considered, except in very rare instances, a vagabond and a slave, doomed to waste his powers for the profit of a chosen few. And what was I? Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as man. I was more agile than they, and I could subsist upon coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I their monster, a blot upon the earth, from which all men fled, and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had been ever remained in my native wood, not known or felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. Okay, so there's a lot there to unpack.
Yes.
Interesting that he, first of all, the idea that, like, he's kind of learned about, okay, this is what society respects, and if you don't have those things, then society treats you as you're a slave. You're lesser than, you belong to someone else, you work for the means of someone else.
Correct,
Which is funny, because, like, he's also a Marxist, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyway, like, so, but yeah, interesting that he does all of that, and then is like, but damn, then, like, what am I? Because, like, I'm even, like, less than that.
Yeah.
Which is, like, really horrifying and sad to think about. And he's like, I'm not like them. I have no one else like me. Also a little bit of a snap judgment because he's only met, like, 3 people.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, get out there. Like, see, put yourself out there. Like, let's see. But yeah. But he's like, there's nobody else like me. What is my place? There's a line here. I just want to repeat this line for a sec. Yeah. I possess no money, no friends, no kinds of property. It just reminds me of a line from, I think, Pride and Prejudice, I'm pretty sure, where there's this, like, one chick, I think it's Pride and Prejudice, who, it's been a long time, who was, like, she's gonna get married. She ultimately decided, and then, like, her other chick, her friend, I think, maybe sister. I literally remember nothing. I just remember somewhat of the context of, like, this one woman being upset that the other woman is, like, getting married. Mm-hmm. And she's like, why are you doing that? And the woman's like, basically says, like, that exact line.
Yeah.
And Clementine and I, our sister, we quote that line all the time.
Yeah.
Because we just think it's, like, funny. And in the context of that story, she's, like, really young, too. And she's like, I have no choice now. I have no property, no money, no means to make, like, I have to get married. Or is it Little Women?
I'm not sure.
I don't know. I can't remember. I still have pneumonia brain, so I can't remember. Clementine, listen to this. Put it in the comments. What's the line I'm thinking of? Yeah, and then, of course, the last thing that I enjoy from this is I cannot describe to you the agony these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Which, of course, again, drawing a parallel to Adam, which we already drew before, mm-hmm. that, like, Adam and Eve are, like, in paradise, and they enjoy paradise, and ultimately the thing that, like, and that being a parable about, like, the danger of knowledge. You know, they're cursed with knowledge almost, where it's like once they have knowledge, that you can't go back from that.
Exactly.
And this creature kind of faces the same fate, where once has knowledge of the world, he's, like, more miserable than he ever was. And had he just remained a simple animal trying to eat and stay alive, life might be better.
Totally.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on that before I read a footnote that I want to read?
No, I'm good.
Okay. So, basically in this chapter, there's one point where, like, he mentions that he, like, learns to speak the language because they're teaching Safi. Right. But then they also teach Safi to read, and he's like, I also learned how to read. Because they, like, taught her how to read.
Yeah.
And then this footnote, it just cracked me up. It is simply not possible that one can learn to read by listening to another person learn to read. Reading is a matter of connecting symbols with meaning, and unless these symbols can be seen or felt, no connection can be made. The creature was certainly too far away to see the symbols in the book. A more plausible theory is that his brain, taken from another French speaker, remembered how to read and speak, and he merely convinced himself that he was learning a skill that he had already possessed. And yada yada yada. It goes into, like, another book that teaches, or not teaches, but, like, has some essays on that subject matter. So,
right.
Yeah, just another sort of clue there. And listen, ultimately, I think it's probably just a little bit of a oversight, a little bit of a buy-in that you have to have as the I think all of this, like, it's interesting to hypothetically have a conversation about, like, is it a fresh soul? Is there a part of him that it is muscle memory? I would venture a guess, personally, that if we, like, asked Mary Shelley, she would just be like, no, like, that's just the story. Like, just buy into the story.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a science fiction story. You also can't reanimate people. So, like, just buy into the fact that these things happen.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, it leads to an interesting discussion, as we already had, right? Like, Is he relearning things? Is he new? Is he a fresh soul? Is he an old soul? Does he have a soul? You know, all these discussions are fun and interesting, but there is no answer. So it's more just like your interpretation of the text. All right, chapter 6.
Chapter 6, hit me with the summary.
Okay. We learn Safi's family, who are Turkish, by the way, were unjustly prosecuted. Felix is part of a rich family in France, and he helps them to escape from their unjust persecution. The father says he and Safi can be together, like Safi's father says that, but ultimately like rescinds on that idea because Felix is a Christian and like they're from Turkey, so they're, I believe, supposed to be Muslim. Yeah. Felix and his family are then exiled for basically breaking the law to help Safi and their family escape, which is how they end up where they're at in this hut. And then Safi ultimately is like, nah, screw this, and leaves her father and then goes to like be with Felix, basically, because she wanted to be with him and they love each other, and that's why Felix helped them escape. So yeah, this chapter is really just like we learn the history of these people,
right?
Which is that they're good people. Like they ultimately like end up getting exiled, but for this thing that they did, again, we kind of have another like tie back in here to the idea of justice. Like we've already seen somebody, Justine, be wrongly persecuted.
That's true.
And so now we see the other side of it. Again, maybe also like a little bit of throwing stones at Victor, like we talk about in Act 2 of Victor. You should feel guilty for Justine's death because look at these people, and these people are good people, and they like got themselves exiled to help save people who they felt were being wrongly persecuted.
Right.
And you, Victor, saw somebody be wrongly persecuted, and you just like stood by and let her be killed.
Okay.
So another throwing stones, another like, you know, you're a bad person, and like ultimately when the monster's request happens at the end of this volume, maybe another justification for Victor being like, I need to atone for my sins.
To accept it, to redeem.
Yeah. But anyway, so what are your thoughts on chapter 6, if any? I know it's more of like a brief history.
It is more of a brief history, yeah. I wrote down basically the same summary that you did.
Yeah.
Just explaining the history, and I think that's a really interesting point. When I was reading this the first time, actually, I was trying to find out how like this relationship between Felix and Safi tied into Victor and his family, and I actually couldn't. And so I just left it at that, and I made a note. I was like, come back to this. I never did. But hearing you now explain that and how that relates to Victor and him almost feeling like he's destined to accept this journey with the monster because of you know, this notion of redeeming himself, or this notion of making up for the death of Justine. I thought that was really interesting. I never thought about that. But yeah, aside from that, I don't really have anything else to elaborate on.
Okay, cool. Then let's go to probably the best chapter in this whole volume, which is chapter 7. Okay, so the creature reads and learns more about the world. Eventually, he decides to introduce himself to the blind man, which is the father. So he waits for the rest of the family to leave. Then he goes. It goes well at first, but when the family returns, they end up attacking him, and he flees. So that's my general summary. I have a few quotes I want to read, and then I have like a larger conversation we can have about the Turing test.
Sure, go for it.
But anyway, before we do that, like, what are your thoughts on this chapter? What notes do you have on this chapter?
So I noted that the monster found pages that Victor wrote about him, and I believe I have a quote on that. Here it is. So it's a bit of a longer section, but I will read it. So he said, soon after my arrival in the hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress which I had taken from your laboratory. And he's talking to Victor here. At first I neglected them, but now that I was able to decipher the characters in which they were written, I began to study them with diligence. It was your journal of the 4 months that preceded my creation. You minutely described in these papers every step you took in the progress of your work. This history was mangled with accounts of domestic occurrences. You doubtless recollect these papers. Here they are. Everything is related in them which bears reference to my accursed origin. The whole detail of that series of disgusting circumstances which produced it is set in view. The minutest description of my odious and loathsome person is given, in language which painted your own horrors and rendered mine ineffaceable. I sickened as I read. And this is a quote from Victor's notes. Hateful day when I received life, I exclaimed in agony. Cursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God in pity made man beautiful and alluring after his own image, but my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid from its very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and detested.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing I kind of took away from that, aside from it being really, like, wrenching to have to read that, is just, I feel like Mary Shelley, and we're going to continue to see this, and you've mentioned some examples from this in your quotes, she's very good at setting the ultimate standard for something and then finding a way to surpass it. And this is kind of like that same notion with that last sentence. Satan had his companions. So even the worst person in the world had his companions, fellow devils to admire and encourage him. And he said, but I'm solitary and detested, stating how not only is he the devil, but he has nobody. He's absolutely on a plane of his own.
Yeah,
I just wanted to point that out. I thought that was really
that's really good. So I actually literally have that paragraph right now as well.
Okay,
that was
cool.
something I was going to read. Okay. I think it's probably like the best piece of writing in this whole book. Not to get ahead of ourselves. I mean, maybe there's better stuff in there.
It's pretty crazy.
I think this is probably the best section of writing in the whole book. Yeah, it's so impossibly sad.
Yeah.
And I think it really, like, you know, this whole section of the book is setting the stage for, like, again, as we'll talk about, and the next few chapters after this go pretty quick, but basically that the monster wants Victor to create somebody for himself, which comes up in chapter 9, finally. But this whole section is sort of like setting the stage for like why it should be impossible for Victor to turn that down. And yeah, I think exactly what you said. Like, even the devil has companions.
Yes,
you know, like,
exactly.
And I am cursed to be completely alone.
Yes,
is such a like sad notion, and again, not a justification for the things that he has done or will do, but yeah, I mean, I think this is probably the best standalone chapter in the whole book, right? Because even everything that happens with the blind father is so sad, because like he goes there and he is like having this conversation with the blind father, and the blind father the whole time is like, dude, like, relax, don't worry, it's all good, like, I'll take care of you. Exactly. Like, nobody should be treated this poorly and all that stuff. And you think for a second, like, damn, okay, like, maybe the monster's gonna be okay. And then, yeah, when the family comes home and they see him and it turns into a disaster, it's just so, it's, like, so impossibly sad. Like,
and it is. And what, just part of what made that also really painful, having to read that, it was stated, I forget who it was, either Safi or Agatha passed out.
Yeah.
The other one of the two of them ran
Somebody's
away.
Somebody's
always passing out when they see the monster.
Yeah.
And then it was said that the monster kind of clung to the old man's feet.
Yes.
And
like a child.
Like a child, exactly. And Felix, like, beat him, like, until he was off of the father's feet. And it just... It made me think, like, of how much he actually cares about the family, even though he's being so persecuted and so, like, destroyed, especially by Felix in this. He has an 8-foot frame. He's giant. He's faster than them. He's stronger than them. He has every capacity to turn on Felix in this scene of being destroyed. And he chooses not to.
As we see in the beginning of this volume, when he, like, evades Victor. He just, like, sidesteps him. Exactly. He's like, what are you doing? Like,
exactly. Yeah. And it makes that all the more painful, knowing that he has the capacity to stand up for himself, but out of his love, even when being persecuted, he doesn't find it in him. He's innately good. He at this point in the story, he's an innately good being.
Yeah. This is very much part of the turning point.
Yes.
Because of the way he's treated here. Yeah, just a fantastic chapter.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so, do you know anything about Alan Turing?
I'm going to be so honest. At first when you said that, I thought you said Rod Sterling. I was like, the Twilight Zone.
Okay.
But no,
it's also Rod Sterling, not Sterling.
Oh, Sterling, okay.
Yeah. Do you know anything about Alan Turing?
Alan Turing. I know he's an impactful figure relating to AI, right?
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah,
I would say yes.
I don't know a lot about what he's taught, though, so...
Alright, cool. So let's give you... First of all, to anybody who doesn't, including you, watch the movie The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch. It's cool. It's about this part of his life that I'm about to describe. Okay, basically, Alan Turing was, like, a closeted gay man, and he was, like, a very profound mathematician, engineer, and later a little bit of philosopher as well. And he, during World War II, basically created the first computer, effectively. And this computer that he created is what helped the Allies break the German Enigma code.
Oh, wow, okay.
Which ultimately is like a huge factor in their success to winning World War II, because up until then we were getting crushed.
Yeah.
So breaking that code was really, really important. Post World War II, it came out that he was gay, and at the time it was illegal to be gay in England, so he was like chemically castrated, and it kind of drove him crazy, and he ultimately ended up killing himself, actually.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so very bad life. And for a long time, although his like more philosophical papers and work on artificial intelligence and computing and math was all well respected, nobody knew about him making the computer that broke the Enigma code because it was a part of a secret project that was like classified, and it's only relatively recently in history, like maybe a few decades ago, maybe not even, I can't remember the exact time, where that information became declassified, and once it became declassified, he was like obviously post-death like pardoned by the British government because obviously it's no longer like a crime to be gay there, and so yeah. So that's like a general history of Alan Turing. Now, so basically, long story short, is the father of like what we think of as modern computing because of that machine. Also then wrote a lot of papers about like AI and stuff like that. I think one day we might do an interview with our dad. Fun fact, our dad is a philosophy professor, specifically in like AI related things and the mind and stuff like that. I don't know what the exact perfect title would be, but stuff like that. I'm turned on to Alan Turing and know about that because I remember when that movie was coming out, my dad was like, oh, we have to go see that movie. So we did, and I think it's safe to say that he's like probably an influence on some of the work that, or some of the research our dad has done, for sure, in terms of like philosophy of artificial intelligence and computing and things of that nature. So, long story short, we may interview him to get more context. And he also is, obviously, we've talked about, loves Frankenstein. So, yes. And you'll see the connection soon, and maybe we'll interview him one day to get more in depth. But I'll say that probably the most famous thing for Turing, like obviously that movie has helped in general with like his public persona, but the most famous thing that he'll probably always be known for is the Turing test, which is something that he wrote about in a paper, and it's a thought experiment that the point of the thought experiment is sort of like to help distinguish the point at which you could say something is truly like artificially intelligent. And how the thought experiment goes is there's, let's say, 2 rooms. I'm going to give you like a paraphrase of the thought experiment. I don't remember the precise way it was laid out.
Right.
But let's say there's 2 rooms, and you can't see into either of those rooms, but you can like receive information from those rooms. Okay? And you are a third person outside of those rooms. Now, you're allowed to ask questions to either of the rooms, and you're told that one room has a machine in it, and one room has a person in it. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, if through the process of you asking those questions and receiving answers, if you are unable to determine from the answers to like reasonably determine which one has the person and which one has the machine, then you would have to say at that point that like that machine is artificially intelligent.
Okay.
Now that is my very crude understanding. I'm sure if we talk to our dad about this, there's like way more layers to it. But yeah, so in general, in sort of like pop culture, if you hear the Turing test, the quick summary of the Turing test people always say is like, if you were to interact with a machine without being able to see it, and it was giving you answers that you could not distinguish from human answers,
it would be artificial intelligence.
That is artificial intelligence.
Okay, I'm following.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, that paper was written in 1950. Mm-hmm. Okay? So what I find fascinating is that this book, written in 1818, and this is what I would like to talk to our dad about and get his thoughts on in terms of could it be an influence, because like there is effectively a Turing test that happens in this chapter in this book where Frankenstein, the creature, who is like unaware of his own existence, doesn't understand what he is, doesn't understand if he's a person even, as he said many, many times, like, what am I?
Exactly.
Like, I'm not even the lowest of the low person. Even the devil has, like, people that, or even Satan has devils around him. Like, he doesn't understand his relation to the world, and then goes and speaks to this blind man who can't see and can only interact with, and through the conversation with this blind man, the blind man is unable at all to determine Frankenstein's monster as being anything other than a person.
Right.
And, like, has many, many lines in it where he refers to the monster as, like, why would anybody treat a person this way? And it's only when his son and daughter and, I guess, daughter-in-law show up that he's given context to, oh, wait, maybe this isn't a person.
Right.
So I just think that's really, really interesting conceptually. Obviously, like, I bring up the Turing test just because it's so interesting to me that exists here when the Turing test was written, like, 100 and 130 years after.
Yes.
Like, he posited the Turing test 130 years after, and it would be, I don't know enough, maybe Dad knows, maybe we would ask Dad, and it would be as simple of an answer as, like, oh no, like, Turing, like, cited Frankenstein as, like, an inspiration for, I don't know, I have no idea. It's totally possible. But I just think that that's interesting.
It's very interesting.
That it predates it, but then also, like, just in the writing of it, like, it's so smart. Because it's so easy now to think of that, to have that context of the Turing test being something that exists in pop culture, and then to incorporate something like that to make us, as readers, care for the monster.
Right.
But when something like that didn't exist, to be like, what is a way I can, once again, as we've talked about, how can we make it clear the sadness of this monster's existence? And all the ways in which we're going to see this creature not be human, in terms of some of the bad actions that he will go on to take, or in terms of his deformity, or, like, does he have a soul? All these things that we've been talking about up to this point. To have this, like, genius idea of, okay, but take sight out of it, and do the Turing test. Like, can you determine anything different from this creature? And you can't. The blind man can't. Just, like, reinforces the sadness of it all.
Yeah.
And reinforces that, yeah, despite these differences and these questions you might be having, like, unquestionably, this creature is more human than not.
Yes, exactly.
And the value, the intrinsic value then that we as a reader kind of put on that creature of thinking of it as being human, and how that maybe, like, reinforces the decision that Frankenstein sort of comes to at the end of this chapter in terms of what he's going to do. Victor Frankenstein, not the monster, the man. Yeah. So anyway, that's all the...
That's very cool.
That's the rant I wanted to go on.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'd be really excited to hear Dad's thoughts about that if you wanted to make a feature on the podcast.
Yeah,
Really
cool. I mean, maybe we'll interview. I don't know if there's anything interesting we're talking about. Like, we can talk to him about it, because it might just be as simple as, like, oh yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that's true.
In which case, like, okay, then we don't.
Yeah.
But if there is some, maybe, history there, maybe, like, there is some inspiration, or maybe he has more context that might make it more interesting, and we could do, like, a 15-minute interview. It would be fun to do that, but
100%.
We'll see. Okay, Chapter 8. The creature, after the DeLacy's flee, so the DeLacy's is the family that lived in that cabin, by the way.
Yes.
We just haven't referred to them by their last name, but
Right.
they're the DeLacy's. So the creature, after the DeLacy's flee, heads towards Geneva to meet his maker. Along the way, he rescues a drowning girl, but is shot. Eventually, he discovers Frankenstein's brother, and after learning his name, kills him in anger. So yeah, now we kind of are catching up to where we are in the story presently, before the creature started recounting this.
Yes.
But yeah, very sad, because he, like, encounters this girl that's drowning and saves her, and then people are like, they think of him as this crazy monster or whatever, so they, like, shoot him.
Yes.
Which I think is sort of like the final straw.
Yeah.
To me, that's the turning point, where he's like, then, like, humans be damned. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like,
Exactly.
You guys are all awful. I have been so awfully mistreated up to this point, and in this moment where I'm objectively doing, like, the best possible thing a person could do, for your reaction to be to shoot me is crazy. And so, like, screw all of you. And ultimately, I think, feeds into the anger of when he discovers Victor's brother, learns that his last name is Frankenstein, and is like, oh, to hell with all of this, and just, like, goes into a blind rage and kills the boy. But, yeah.
Yeah. And, something else about Chapter 8 that I think is worth pointing out is the monster was furious and took his anger out on inanimate objects.
Yeah.
And that reminded me of, like, a temper tantrum, kind of going back to that kid analogy, where he's just, like, frustrated, and obviously instead of throwing stuff around the house, he's obviously bigger, so he's going to go outside, and he's going to mess up the environment a little bit. And something else relating to that is going back to that idea of the fire and kind of what it symbolizes. It says, that night he burned the cottage to the ground and left forever. Yeah, that's just, like, the symbol of his rage, kind of. And just, and burning that cottage to the ground after, and it's worth noting that the whole family leaves after this, like, they're gone.
Yeah, they fled.
Yeah, they fled, they're gone. It's the fact that he burned to the ground is kind of the fact that he burned to the ground the last bit of love he had for man.
Yeah.
Like you said, too. And just the fire is, like, that symbol, and, like I said, it shows his rage, and I wrote down that the monster grew in hatred and fury for man, and he swore revenge. And he resolved to find his creator. And as you said, he murdered William, but not out of a intent to be malicious. And yeah,
No, I don't think that's true. I think it was an intent to be malicious, but it's just fueled by, like, blind rage. It's fueled by all these things. Like, he says, he's like, I learned that the kid's name was Frankenstein. I destroyed that kid.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
I think I'm confusing that with the girl he saved then.
Yeah.
I think I messed up those two. But okay.
Yeah, he just straight up does save the girl. He's like, this is wrong.
Right.
Whatever.
And he gets shot.
And then
for
he gets
that.
shot.
Okay,
and that's
yeah.
when he's like, I'm done.
I confused those.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. I gotcha. And then this unknowing to the monster planted the seed for Justine's sentence, and then this will obviously go back to Victor and his petition to Victor to create him this monster, or else his rage would extend to the rest of his family and all of humanity.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
just poor guy.
Poor guy, but he did also straight up kill his brother.
He did. But honestly,
And I think we're starting now to see that little bit of, like, again, he is ultimately a villain.
yeah. Well, I would say antagonist. I don't know.
Anti-hero.
If villain's right. Yeah.
I don't. Not really.
No, not
anti-hero.
really
I guess
anti-hero.
antagonist. I guess
Yeah.
protagonist and antagonist is better. But yeah, I mean, but also you know, one of the things we talked about, and just to give, you know, a little bit of foreshadowing, right, for chapter, or for what's going to happen in volume 3, but the idea that there are just certain rules in drama, and it's like if a character breaks those rules, like, they have to be punished for it. They can't be redeemed, and murder is one of them, right? Like, there is no justification dramatically. If a character has murdered someone, they need to face some type of punishment for that, which let's keep in our minds as we then read on into Act 3 of this, and we discuss that later. But yeah, I mean, it's sad because you see the series of events that lead up to it. And I agree with you. I think sort of the burning of the house is a very nice visual metaphor.
Yeah.
For the end of, like, what could have been.
Yes.
Like, that house is what could have been, and the fact that it didn't work out is now, like, I have nothing left. What's that? It's Harry Osborn that says it, right? In Spider-Man 2, when he's like, I have nothing left except Spider-Man.
Yeah.
You know that meme? Like,
yeah,
that's like the monster with Frankenstein right now. He's like, I have nothing left except Victor. Like, everything has been taken. He's like, I have no existence other than to torment Victor.
Right.
And when he reaches Victor, he ultimately, as you said, it's like, either you need to give me a reason for existence, or all I'm left with as a reason for existence is to destroy you.
Yes. Exactly.
I want to read this. This is the quote that starts chapter 8.
Sure.
It's a quote from the monster. He says, cursed creator, why did I live? Why in that instance did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly bestowed? I know not. Despair had not yet taken possession of me. My feelings were those of rage and revenge. I could with pleasure have destroyed the cottage and its inhabitants, and have glutted myself with their shrieks and misery. So, yeah, like, he is, like, depressed. Like,
yes.
he at this point is, I mean, he starts the chapter. He's like, what is my existence if not just rage and revenge? Like, and I think it really, it just ties into what his request ultimately is of Victor. And it's smart because Victor needs that, because we've seen, even just when Victor created this creature, and we can talk about chapter 9 now too, because all that happens in chapter 9 is that Victor ultimately is like, all right. Exactly. Like, there's not, and Victor's like, okay, I'll make, it's the story from the creature is now done, and Victor says, okay, I will make you a partner.
Exactly.
I'll make you a female. He agrees to it, basically.
Yes.
But I think it's important because, like, if we remember that when Victor first creates this creature, Frankenstein's monster, he, like, immediately is like, oh, I made a mistake. And he's so distraught about that mistake. And this whole time, he's like, this is a mistake. And so we need a justification, like a really strong justification for how Victor could then think that maybe he needs to, why he would go about making a partner for the creature.
Right.
And I think there are so many great, again, there's the religious solutions, there's, like, the responsibility you have to me as my creator. That's one. We get the trial of the other family and them being these, like, ultimate good people who were willing to sacrifice themselves, and Victor still reeling over the death of Justine. That's 2. And then ultimately 3, we have now the threat from the monster being like, I have nothing in my life. So if you don't give me something in my life will just be to torment you, and it won't just be William. It'll be everyone.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It's the social network. Like, I'm not coming back for 5%. I'm coming back for everything. Like that's the creature in this moment.
Yeah.
You better lawyer up. That's what this is. So it's like we have this 3-pronged approach that this story has taken. Again, that this sort of like short story in the middle of that, like Act 2 of this is its own self-contained short story, and where the monster has this beginning, middle, and end of like not understanding, learning everything, and then being completely like made to feel miserable from it, and comes out of that now being like, okay, so I will ruin everything because and also you owe me something. Like you owe me somebody to be with. Everybody is owed like other people like them.
Right.
And if you can't give that to me, then yeah, I'm just gonna tear it all down.
Right.
I'm gonna go full villain mode.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, that's pretty interesting. I do have a quote. Since we've already leaned into chapter 9 because it's
we'll just do them both together.
Yeah.
Chapter 9 is like 2 paragraphs. It's
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
And then I said sure.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So on page 123, in my text, it says, "For myself, I was passive in all arrangements." This is Victor talking. "For myself, I was passive in all arrangements, and the gentle affection of my beloved Elizabeth was inadequate to draw me from the depth of my despair. The promise I had made to the demon weighed upon my mind like Dante's iron cowl on the heads of the hellish hypocrites," which is an illusion. "All pleasures of earth and sky passed before me like
Actually, it's a simile.
a simile."
They use the word like. So.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, continue.
"All pleasures of earth and sky passed before me like a dream, and that thought only had to me the reality of life. Can you wonder that sometimes a kind of insanity possessed me, or that I saw continually about me a multitude of filthy animals inflicting on me incessant torture, and often extorted screams and bitter groans?" So for here I wrote that it's kind of confirming Victor's tragic destiny, in part because he said, "And the gentle affection of my beloved Elizabeth was inadequate to draw me from the depth of my despair." And she was always like that fallback of like she could rescue him from every sense of despair. She was his love, and even now he's saying like that's not even enough anymore. Which is point A, and then also, can you wonder that sometimes a kind of insanity possessed me, which is just literally Victor being like, yeah, I'm tweaking out now sometimes. Just that fall is kind of being established at the end of volume 2.
Right.
So yeah, I just thought that was significant. But yeah, do you have any other thoughts about chapter 9, chapter 8?
I do not.
I think that pretty much wraps it up.
I think we're at a great place with this story. I mean, the stage has been set. Victor has reluctantly agreed to make a partner for his creature, a bride of Frankenstein, if you will.
Yep.
Which is where that name comes from for that movie.
Yeah.
And yeah, we've now set the stage, right? We've set up Victor as a bad person. Didn't take any responsibility for his actions in creating the creature. Didn't take any responsibility for the death of Justine. And we set up this path for redemption where the creature acknowledges, yes, I did the wrong thing and I shouldn't have killed your brother in cold blood, but you have left me with nothing but rage and despair. So either we can now, in the third act, go down this path where you give me something and I promise you that if you give me a wife, we will just go and you will never see from us again. Or if not, then you've made your bed and you need to lie in it.
Right.
And we're going to see what Victor's choices are and the actions of that as we go through.
Yeah, I'm just curious, how much do you remember from Volume 3? Like, if anything at all?
I remember the key points.
Okay. So
I remember,
you are, like, familiar with the plot.
Yeah, I remember
Okay.
Victor's decision regarding the creature that he's making.
Yep.
I remember how that plays out. And then I remember something that happens... Well, I don't want to spoil it.
Yeah, that's okay. I was just curious.
In
if you
Victor's
remembered
personal
anything.
life.
Yeah.
Something that happens in Victor's personal life, and I also remember how we tie into the story with Walton on the boat again in the letters.
Okay.
But I don't remember all. I just remember like the summary points, like this, then that.
Right.
So I'm curious to see, because there's like a handful of chapters. I'm curious to see the connective tissue of it.
Oh yeah, it's awesome. There's a lot.
I also remember the ending, but
yeah, of course.
okay.
Yeah, we're gonna get to all that.
Maybe in a week, maybe in another month.
Yep.
Depends if we get pneumonia again.